I think that ecosystems have specific first principles. And it was interesting. I had somebody on who wrote a book called Centers of Progress, 40 Cities That Changed the World. And it was really interesting because I recently had gotten kind of a little obsessed with like Paris in the 1920s. And it was great because like, oh, she's got this in the book. And it wasn't Paris in the 1920s. It was Paris in the 1600s. But if you kind of just covered it up a little bit, you're like, oh, there's actually, it feels like Paris in the 1920s. They were just talking about different things and doing, so there was a very much of a still first principles in that. And my theory is if you have those first principles of ecosystems, and then you kind of layer on the sectors of the moment, when the sector, the company, and the capital all line up, that's when you really have kind of that generational outcome. So the point being, if you want to be building foundational AI, you probably should get your ass to San Francisco. If you want to build the next big like cell therapy company, you should probably be in Boston. You know, when I think about for like, you know, being selfish in Austin for a second, I think about the convergence of the digital and the physical, that makes a lot of sense in Austin. And so when you kind of see these different kinds of companies, these different things, I think that makes a lot of sense. So, and so when it's the Shenzhen, I was like, yeah, this is kind of the cheap market, the hardware, that was kind of back to that first principles of Shenzhen. So first, do you think I'm completely off base in kind of my thinking? And then I know you guys are in New York and you kind of invest all over. I mean, what do you think about the differences of kind of some of these ecosystems?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you talk about first principles, I mean, first and foremost, you have to have a place that supports the kind of work that you want to see done. So I actually come from an artistic background in this kind of mentality, which is like, look, painters, there's a paint shop down the street from me. It's up until 4 a.m. You might think, why the hell is a paint shop that sells like brushes and paints open till 4 a.m.? Guess when artists work, or at least some artists work, right? They're waking up. I have an artist friend, wakes up at 9 p.m. and paints until 4 a.m. Because that's it. When it's quiet, people aren't around, he's not distracted, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have to have that paint shop. There was no paints. He runs out of a green or whatever the case. I'm sort of exaggerating, but you run out of green. What, are you going to stop your whole painting for that night because you don't have paint that, he goes straight down to the store, picks it up, goes back to work and has a good conversation, whatever the case may be, and is back in the groove. And so when you look at places like Shenzhen, yes, these are like electronics artists. They're building a new tool. They're building a new phone. And Yuta has a lot of great examples of this. But it's one of those where it's like, oh, I'm missing a very specific part in order to make this work. I can just walk out my door down the street. Someone knows exactly what I need. And if they don't have it, they can actually make it right there on the spot. And I'm walking home in 10 minutes, continuing my project. And I think that's very different from a mentality of like Amazon next day. You know, when you're in a flow state, and I'm sure you've read Flow or at least know the book, but, popular in all Silicon Valley circles. But, flow states, you don't have to be down to the minute in a flow state. But I do think that idea of like, well, I have to do it next, tomorrow, I have to do it the next day. That loop is the difference, right? So if you're an AI in San Francisco and you get stuck on a bug and you have a very smart scientist who lives on your flat on the same floor in your Victoria and you say, hey, what's going on over here? Oh, here's what you did wrong. Now you're back in the flow. You just saved, yes, it was 10 minutes, but the point here is your flow didn't get interrupted. Whereas maybe in another city or in the Midwest or whatever, that might have taken 2 or 3 days or maybe 2 weeks. And that flow kind of gets disrupted and you just can't build. So I think that's part A. Your second question was, are there differences? Or obviously there are differences, but observations of different ecosystems. I think what's interesting is obviously there's sort of this, because tech has gotten so big, millions of people are in tech. This is not 15 years ago where YC, when it had jumped over to Silicon Valley, was 10 teams, right? There were 25 founders. It's hard to believe how small. And people forget that Y Combinator was founded in Boston, right? The first cohort of it, the first 7 folks,
had no idea
were in Cambridge, Massachusetts, right? And Paul Graham, who was very attached to Harvard and the Cambridge ecosystem, really believed there's a lot there. Was like, look, I think it has to be where the capital is, and ends up moving it. It's actually, I think, one of those definitive, was Y Combinator the cause of Silicon Valley or Silicon Valley the cause of Y Combinator? It's hard to know. But clearly, like, there was a linchpin for Boston that was lost. But to me, because there's millions of people in the industry today, it's a little bit hard to pick out differences because so many people flow from one place to the other. Before the show, we were talking about how many folks have moved from Silicon Valley to Austin. thousands of folks have made that migration. And so is Austin culture just different, or is it just all the Silicon Valley emigres? Same with Miami, same with New York, is just flooded with folks from Silicon Valley who want a better lifestyle and working public transit. So I think there's like a common culture, and then yes, there are variations. I mean, even within a city, I think of New York as a place where crypto is along the L line here in Brooklyn. A lot of AI is in Dumbo. One of our companies, Runway, is down there. You have kind of the old
micro hubs, even with
little micro hubs.
Yeah.
And by the way, why do micro hubs exist? Because it's neighborhoods. You can walk over to those offices, right? You can go get a drink with people who are in the same industry, doing the same problems as you. And that advantage of in-person interaction is impossible to beat.